see this thing, I'm going to violate that sort of in the first instance as the next panel gets ready. My wonderful friend and colleague, Loren Schulman, her voice is in a precarious state, but she's going to moderate the panel anyway, so she's asked me to do a brief introduction of the panel, which I'll do. The intent of this panel is to really dive deep into the governance aspects of any national security transition. All of the panelists were associated in one way or another with the transition in 08 and 09, which I think most historians will end up looking back on as one of the better examples of a sort of a truly professional national security transition that was run from the very top through all elements of statecraft in a very professional manner. And we want to sort of mine that experience with these four panelists and with all of you to sort of talk about how, from a governance perspective, we can best ensure that the next national security team gets off onto the best foot. Our panelists need no introduction. My wonderful friend and colleague, Loren Schulman, Michèle Flournoy, Stephen Hadley, and Ambassador Eric Edelman. Thank you. And we queued up a video for you to watch as well, so we can roll that right now. Thanks.
On January 20th, 2017, a new president will take the oath of office. It is one of the most quintessential American moments, the peaceful transition of leadership in the world's most powerful democracy. It is a period of anticipation and expectation, but it is also a period fraught with tension, uncertainty, and a sense of vulnerability as the old team passes the baton to the new, often with some foreboding. History tells us that most presidents inherit active conflicts and crises that do not slow down, nor wait for the next administration to come up to speed. The importance of the transition is no mystery to foreign governments, including hostile ones. Thus, there is no honeymoon period for foreign policy. How well the next president-elect and his or her team make use of the transition period to prepare for their first months in office can be a crucial determinant of how successful an administration can be, and how allies, partners, and adversaries view the United States during a critically important period.
I think the president-elect is going to be most focused on people. People are often policy, and key positions like Secretary of State, Defense, National Security Advisor, these will drive the nature, the character, the behavior of their administration. I think presidents-elect understand that.
The first few months of a new presidency generate significant political and institutional momentum, either for a president's core national security priorities or against them. Selecting an effective group of national security leaders to drive the administration's agenda is critical. But with dozens of positions to fill and an increasingly lengthy confirmation process, the placement and confirmation of a new team can take months. To give an example, key posts related to intelligence and homeland security remained unfilled in the summer of 2001, just before 9/11.
It is so important for the incoming national security team to have a shared sense of purpose, to get broad strategic-level guidance from the president-elect on key national security issues, and to have a well-developed sense of how both issues and crises will be managed. The transition period is critical to start building that sense of team, to set priorities, and to make sure that you can really hit the ground running without stumbling. Nothing's ever going to be perfect, and you need to anticipate challenges and even missteps. But as President Eisenhower famously said, and I love this quote, "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything." Every hour a new president and his or her team invests in planning their new agenda, in planning how they're going to work as a team, is an investment that will accrue dividends, not only for the new administration, but also for the American people.
Michèle, thank you so much for joining us this morning. As Sean said, I'm Loren Schulman, the Deputy Director of Studies here at CNAS. We're here to talk about presidential transitions and national security. So all of you have experienced transition from a lot of perches in government, at the White House, at embassies, at DOD. And anytime I teach a class on national security, I always have to remind students how really difficult and overwhelming a time period this is. and how there's not really a comparable example outside of government. Fortune 500 companies don't generally change out their whole C-suite all at one time. Sports teams, ideally, don't switch out their head coach and their quarterback and their offensive line all in one season, though sometimes other examples happen. I remember staffing the DoD transition in 2008, and just the sheer physics and bureaucracy of bringing in nearly 400 political appointees, particularly during wartime, is just unbelievable. Because in that time period, in the November to January timeframe and in the early months of the administration, new senior leaders have to take on the very mundane, from where's my office, who are my staff, where's my parking spot, to the incredibly complex and consequential. In their inbox, they have challenges that are left unresolved from the outgoing administration, the setting priorities for the new administration, whatever surprises other countries will spring on them in that time period, and getting to know their counterparts both across government and across the world. So making the most of that transition by preparing themselves is incredibly important, which leads me to my first question that I'd like all three of you to give your take on. So each of you has either led or participated in national security transitions from a lot of different posts. What advice do you wish you'd passed on to your successor in government, or what advice do you wish you'd received from your predecessor going into that time frame? And Eric and Michèle, I'll leave you to manage the slight awkwardness of that question. Michèle, if you could go first.
Well, thank you, Loren. I think every national security transition team comes in with an understandable focus on the policy priorities. We've just had a panel talking about the incredibly daunting inheritance for the next administration, all the different issues that they're going to have to deal with. But I think I want to compliment, actually, Eric in the kind of transition and handoff that he engineered for me when I followed him as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. But I think in general, we don't pay enough attention to the leadership and management agenda. How are you actually going to lead your team successfully? How are you going to set priorities? How are you going to help people understand what their jobs are? Establish role clarity, establish a functioning team that works well together, setting not only the policy priorities, but very clear expectations of what you expect people to achieve, how they're going to be measured, how you're going to hold them accountable, how you're going to ensure that your time and your bandwidth and your effort is actually aligned with your priorities. So I guess I would say the one piece of advice I would give is, yes, have your clear policy agenda and priorities, but also spend time on your leadership and management agenda, the how how you're going to work together, how you're going to manage large organizations, and get that synchronization of effort going forward.
Steve?
So I'm tempted to say, give you one thing in about 7 different parts. But
Perfect.
I'll give you 3 that I think are important. One is, I think the new team that comes in needs to be told that the process that they inherit is not adequate to the challenges they face. And they are going to have to think about re-engineering the interagency process. It's the same process that Henry Kissinger established in the 1960s. It does not have the bandwidth to deal with all the problems we've got in the way that it has come to deal with those problems, which is in great detail and with lots of meetings and lots of process. So I think that's one. Second, I think it's a reminder to the new team that every new administration comes in thinking that they've been vindicated, the folks going out have been discredited, and they're now going to write history on a blank sheet of paper. And I think a little reminder that there's going to be a lot more continuity in your policies, and you're going to be building on what was left before, done before, is an important reminder. And then one other thing that I would say is something that George Shultz writes about in a book, Things on My Mind. It's not quite right, the title, but that's it. He says that, and Michèle unfortunately has heard this, so this is a reprise. He says that once a week he would tell his outer staff that he was going to go into his office, close the door, and he wasn't to be disturbed unless his wife called or the president called. And they thought that he was going in there to sleep and take a nap. But what he says he did, and I believe it, was he would sit down with a yellow pad and a pencil, and he would take the problem that they were dealing with at the day, and he would say, what is the problem? What are we trying to do? In simple terms, what's our strategy for getting it done? There is so much pressure on NSC principals and the process now with so many crises. I don't think we take the time to have that kind of reflective analysis, and I think any new team needs to find a way to build that into their process.
Eric?
Thank you, Loren, and it's great to be here seated to Steve Hadley's right. I think that's perfectly appropriate, and to have Michèle on his left.
I feel like the bologna in the sandwich.
We're completely fair and balanced here. So for my sins, starting as a junior Foreign Service officer in 1981, I have been involved in every transition in one way or another since the 1981 transition. And so I've observed a lot of them. And from that, I have, picking up on something Steve said, I have derived sort of three phases of the transition. There's an iron law of transitions that my former colleague Avis Bolin once identified, which applies to the career employees, which was no matter how much you hated the last groups of bastards who were running the place, the new political appointees make you have nostalgia for the last group. But I observed three phases of this. The first phase is in the rosy afterglow of the election, when there is demonstrably in the public a rallying behind the candidate. I mean, even in the era that we're in now, where you have lesser public approval of elected officials, still new presidents enter office on average with about 60% approval, no matter how much they were disliked or in a campaign or attacked. And in that sort of rosy afterglow, there is each transition team, both for the outgoing administration, the incoming administration, says, this is going to be the best transition ever. We're not going to drop a stitch. We're going to hit the ground running. Everything is going to be great. And then the human beings involved begin to actually work together, which kind of leads to the second phase of the transition, which is that the outgoing team spends enormous amounts of time and energy and levels whole forests in order to put together very, very large briefing books in which they try to explain to the incoming administration that we know you guys won and that we're going out and that you think we've screwed everything up, but we've come to these conclusions through the school of hard knocks, and really we want to just help share our experience with you, and this is our prize pig, and really you want to buy this prize pig. And the incoming administration looks at these briefing books and says, it looks like a pig to me, and then into the trash it goes, which then leads to the third stage, in which the outgoing guys say, God, we thought these guys were geniuses, they won the election, they were supposed to be great, they can't even organize a two-car motorcade, they're terrible, and the incoming team goes, God, we thought the earlier guys were bad, but we didn't realize how bad it was. And things are so screwed up, it's going to take us at least 4 years, maybe 8, maybe 12 to get the mess straightened out that they left, and then things go on. Actually, in the 2008-9 transition that Michèle and I worked on together in defense, we actually were blessedly able to not go through that. And that, I would like to say that was because of Michèle and me, but I think really the major factor was Bob Gates, who was staying on as Secretary of Defense, and therefore, we were able to do things with a minimum, frankly, of friction and fuss and muss and bother. By the way, just as an example of how badly things can, get off track and without direction, I'm not sure if Michèle recalls this, but in the summer of 2008, it came to my attention that some overzealous subordinates in OSD policy had blocked a group of people from CNAS going to Afghanistan. And that was because CNAS was the opposition. That was a Democratic think tank. And when I found out about this, I called Michèle. I personally apologized, and I said, we're turning this back on. You can send people out. Now, I mean, when I found out about it, my first reaction was, are you people crazy? I mean, Michèle is very likely to be one of the top candidates, if not the top candidate, to succeed me, and I don't want to get this screwed up before we even start. So, there are a lot of ways that human beings can get involved in this and screw things up. But Gates, I think, made it, very, very easy. I would just say one final thing about what kind of advice, I would give. It would depend a little bit on, what kind of transition it is, because it depends on who's coming in. And if I were in my old position today and was advising someone coming in as part of the Trump transition, I would very much kind of hearken to the advice that Steve gave, which is before you start changing things, try and understand why the policy is in place beforehand. Before you start reorganizing things and moving people around, try to understand the organization and being as it is before you start changing things. That's a lesson I learned actually from Secretary Shultz when I was his special assistant when he took over from Al Haig in the State Department, different kind of transition. If it were a Clinton transition, I think I would actually repair to my experience in the Reagan-Bush 41 transition, because transitions between two different administrations of the same party, we sometimes assume are going to be easy and kind, and they usually turn out to be the nastiest, most brutal, and unpleasant transitions that exist. And that's because the outgoing team thinks that, will think that Secretary Clinton was elected to be a third term for President Obama, and the incoming Clinton team will understandably be focused on the first term of President Clinton, and there will be lots of friction that flows from that. So my counsel to an incoming Clinton team would be, don't assume that this is going to be smooth and rosy. There's going to be a lot of bumps in the road here.
Steve, I want to go back to your first piece of advice on national security process, and you've talked a lot about this, that transition is really a moment to examine how that national security system works, or in your words, not working very well, and to really consider the bureaucratic habits that undergird that system, both what meetings are held, who goes, but also more broadly, how to develop strategy, how to set objectives, and really drive the president's agenda. And you've talked a lot about how that system, which has not changed, as you said, in decades, is not adequate to the challenges that we have today. I wondered, could you talk a little bit more about the challenges you see in that system, but more specifically, what questions you think a transition team should be examining in that time period to look at how to reform it before the next administration?
Sure, and my colleagues here will add to that. I should say that A, I've not been in the interagency process for 8 years, so my views are all from the outside. And B, I'm not throwing stones at anybody, because I wish when I became National Security Advisor, I had done a step back look, which I did not do. But the impression you get from the outside is that there are so many issues because of the breakdown really of the liberal international order and crises all over the place. There are so many issues that, and there's only so many hours in the day and days in the week for that group of people that is the senior levels of the interagency process to deal with them. So a couple things happen from that. One is things tend to get on that agenda when they are late in the crisis. And when you're late in the crisis, most of the long-term, the options that really take a long time to have effect, some of your diplomatic options, your economic options, your development options, are in the rearview mirror. There's not enough time. So there's a tendency, I think, and these folks there more recently, but my sense is there's a tendency to get caught in a situation that, you either do nothing or you send in the troops. And that's not a good framework. You owe the president something more. And in order to do that, you've got to stay out of constant crisis management. If all you're doing is handling one crisis after another, I would argue all you're going to get is more crises, because you're not going to have taken the time to put in place the strategies and policies to shape events and avoid crises. So I think one of the things that needs to be done is sort of four things. One, I think the senior levels of the interagency process need to get out of the weeds. They need to take an issue and do what George Shultz tried to do. What's the problem? What's our objective? And in gross terms, what's our strategy? That's what the senior levels with the president should be focusing on. And then they need to delegate the implementation and execution to an empowered set of cabinet officials, empowered diplomats, empowered assistant secretaries of state and defense, empowered military and intelligence officers. Let's have a distributed execution and implementation. It's not fire and forget. You're going to hold people accountable, but you're going to free them to actually do their jobs. And if you do that, you're going to expand dramatically the bandwidth of the crises we can deal with, because the senior levels are going to be focused on setting strategy and not get into the details, which is where all the multiple meetings come from. And then they are going to trust those below them, empowered and enabled by the process, to go forward. Second of all, every administration tries to have some kind of cell in the White House that works with policy planning staffs and strategy staffs in the agency to do real strategy work, to try to keep them out of the day-to-day, to develop those strategies and policies that affect for the long term. We've got to do that. It requires a lot of discipline. Nobody, I don't think, has done it well. We tried. I think we can do better. I think we've got to, the new team needs to think about how they're going to build strategy in the process. And thirdly, something that Graham Allison has actually talked about, and that is we don't have enough sense of history. One of my great regrets is that I read political science. I should have been reading history. Graham talks about having a applied history cell, 2 or 3 historians in the White House whose job is to look at a crisis and say, now what are the historical precedents? And what do they tell us we might do? What do they tell us we might avoid? I think that and the strategy focus would really enrich the deliberations and would get the senior people up out of the weeds thinking about tactics and talking about what are we trying to achieve and how do we achieve it. Because I've been in too many interagency meetings which are on the docket for 50 minutes and they start in the tactics, and about 40 minutes in, somebody says, well, wait a minute, what are we trying to do here? That is a failure of the NSC-led interagency process, because that's the question you need to start with, and that's the question that senior policy folks need to be struggling with.
Michèle, Eric, do you have thoughts on top of that?
Well, I agree with Steve. I think that's been a persistent failure. I mean, like him, I have not been in the process for 8 years, so I can't comment on how it goes. But in my own experience, the number of interagencies meetings that begin with what are our talking points going to be is distressingly high, as opposed to what is the problem and what are we trying to, what's the problem we're trying to solve and what do we want to accomplish. I really think, I think in the video that you saw earlier, Bridge, when he was interviewed, was saying, personnel is policy, and I feel that very keenly. Secretary Gates used to say that all the time. He used to joke that he was never allowed in a political science classroom at A&M when he was president, because he would have told people to just throw all this stuff out. It's all really about the personal relationships among the principals. And I think one of the real problems is the staffing of the government that goes on, while this transition is underway. I think in the Bush administration, one of the problems we had was because of the disputed election, transition time, someone once said to me, is worth 3 times government time. Because once you actually start in government, you're drinking from the fire hose. It's very hard to get out of the crisis management mode that Steve was describing. So you really need to use that time to try and get some policy direction thought through and in place before you actually kind of jump into the thing. And then you're also staffing up, at that point. I think it's really imperative, and I hope, we have the Transition Act now, which allows transition planning to start in July of the election year, which is really even earlier, I think, which is a good thing. But I think, I hope that the two transition teams are focusing on recruiting people to staff the government based, first of all, on professional qualifications, and secondly, on their ability to work together as a team. For my sins, I co-chaired the defense transition for Governor Romney 4 years ago with John Lehman and Senator Jim Talent. And as we started to put together slates of people who we thought could serve in senior positions or ought to be serving in senior positions, I actually see some faces as I look out into the room who are on those lists. We were focused very much on the question of who can work together. How do you put this together as a team? And it included some people who were serving in the then first term of the Obama administration who we thought should stay on or be put into different positions, which may come as a shock to people. But we were very much focused on the question of a team. And I think that is really imperative. And I worry that in the case of the Trump transition, the divisions inside the Republican national security establishment are very deep. I'm a part of that problem, I guess. And how they recruit people, I think, is going to be a challenge. I think, in a sense, on the Clinton transition, you have almost the opposite problem. They've got such a well-staffed policy apparatus that, as one of my friends on the Clinton campaign has said, we've got too many mouths to feed.
Michèle, you actually wrote about the team building aspect in your 9 lessons for navigating national security, and I wonder if you could go into a little more detail on that. How is it they should use transition to really focus on team building, and what can be done in the first months of administration to really help at the principals and deputies level get that team aspect going rather than just appointing people based on their individual experience?
Sure. The first thing I would say is how you think about your selection criteria. And we are famous for selecting individual, best athletes in a vacuum. We select the best expert, we select the best individual for a job as if they're going to be doing it all by themselves. We don't tend to select a team as a team and look at the dynamics, the chemistry, the synergy, the complementarity. One of my most memorable moments in the Obama transition was the first day walking into the main headquarters and seeing this gigantic banner that said, "No ego, no drama, this is not about you." Right? I mean, it's really not about your individual career progression and performance. It is about getting the mission done on behalf of the president and on behalf of the nation. And so, but I think so the first thing I would say is, factor in the team dynamics and the team complementarity in the selection process itself. Once you have people in place, there needs to be a fairly focused effort to actually norm and form the team. I think one of the best practices from the Bush-Obama transition was they actually put the new team and the old team side by side and put them through a tabletop exercise of a crisis. What if? An attack on the homeland, I think it was. And sort of not only helped with some knowledge transfer about the tools and approaches from one team to the other, but also started to help that new team start working as a team. One of my regrets is, when I first came in as Undersecretary in DOD, the Undersecretary for Policy usually represents the Secretary on the Deputies Committee. I came in, realized I knew a lot about Iraq, I didn't know as much about Afghanistan, I needed to get there. Because I'm in DOD, I actually had the means of getting there. I could get a plane and go. My mistake was that I didn't invite all the other deputies to come with me on that first trip. We could have had a big jump ahead on the Afghan policy review had we gone on sort of that learning trip together rather than me just going by myself. With staff. So you have to consciously think about how you're going to norm and form the team. I think also explicit conversations about roles and responsibilities and how you're going to hold people accountable. Secretary Gates was very, very candid with his individual direct reports. This is your lane, this is what I want you to achieve, this is how I'm going to evaluate your performance. That, over there is somebody else's lane. Don't go there, I'll slap your hand if you do. That's his job, not your job, leave it. And then he enforced that. I think the last thing I'll say is I want to footstop, Steve's point about empowerment. In this complex world, you cannot try to manage everything centrally. You have to set direction and then decentralize the execution. Now, the problem is, in the first months of every administration, something's going to go wrong. Someone's going to make a mistake, something's going to go wrong with execution, something's going to leak when it shouldn't have. And the question is, how do you respond to that first mistake? One response is, oh, this system can't be trusted. I'm going to pull everything up into the White House and I'm going to try to do it all centrally. And you will be overwhelmed and buried under the execution details, and you will lose sight of the important questions of strategy. The other approach is to say, A, let's really understand what happened and let's try to learn from our failures as a team. B, evaluate, do I need to make some adjustments, if there's a problem in the team, and C, some real accountability. Secretary Gates was famous for letting people go if they weren't up to the job. I had my own experience of having to do that as Undersecretary for Policy. It's the worst part of leadership, but that's a different approach to accountability that I think maintains a system where you're empowering people, you're expecting them to perform, you're clear about what they're supposed to do, but you hold them accountable in a different way rather than pulling everything, upending the system and trying to manage risk all from the center, which just won't work in this complexity of environment.
Eric, I'm going to shift the topic to talking about transition in wartime. The 2008-2009 transition was an incredibly delicate and dangerous moment in American history, with a new president and national security team taking office in the middle of two major conflicts, with over 150,000 troops deployed overseas. And while the dynamic in Iraq and Afghanistan has shifted considerably in the last 8 years, we can't yet say that the tides of war are receding, to use a phrase of President Obama's. So when the next president comes into office, there's still going to be several thousand troops deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq and in the CT fight. And I wondered if you could talk about how the last administration prepared for a wartime transition and the advice that you'd offer to the current and next administration on how to really manage that vulnerable time.
Well, I mean, in a sense, Loren, my answer to this question is similar to my answer to the first question, which is, first of all, there was a lot of self-awareness that we were engaged in the first wartime transition since 1968, essentially. That was the last time that there'd been a presidential transition in time of war from Johnson to Nixon. So Secretary Gates was very, very well aware of this. He had been extraordinarily focused, as he has written about and said when he came in, on Iraq and to a somewhat lesser extent Afghanistan. I mean, his view was, as he once said to me, the president hired me to fix things in Iraq and get Afghanistan right, and I'm going to punt a lot of other issues, like what do we do about the tanker lease appeal, to the next secretary. He then joked later on that he didn't realize that he was going to be punting to himself because he had to then receive things. So the fact that we had Secretary Gates presiding over the departure of the previous administration, incoming administration coming in, I think made it a lot easier to manage that wartime transition. I don't, you may have some element of that if there's a Obama to Clinton transition this time around. If there's a transition to Trump, I think it's going to be a lot more up in the air about exactly how this goes. I think self-awareness is very important. I think just impressing upon the new team that the nation still is at war and that we still have a lot of people deployed, and where some of the other snares are for them, where the things that might go wrong in the first few months. But one of the things that is perfectly predictable, Michèle was saying this a moment ago, is something will happen in the first 3 or 4 months, and it'll be something that nobody is prepared for because no one's really thought about it. EP3 crisis in the spring, April of 2001. None of us in the Bush administration thought we were going to be dealing with a major crisis with China in the first 4 months of the administration. But it will happen. And so trying to you know, you can't anticipate it. If you try and guess it, you'll be wrong, but try and just make them sensitive to the fact this is going to happen. You know, be prepared that something is going to happen, and try and have a checklist ready for what you want to, you know, what are the steps you want to go through as you deal with this unexpected crisis that's on your hands.
Okay, let's turn it over to questions from the audience. If you could just raise your hand, we have mics circulating throughout. Let's see, right here. Right.
Charlie Dowling from Duke Law School. To what extent does a transition involve, or should it involve, a systematic review of senior military leadership and changes if necessary? Or is that politically off limits during the transition phase?
I'll give you a reaction. I was in the Pentagon during the Bush 41 administration. I'm worried about a trend we've seen with every election cycle of military officers, in particular retired military officers, speaking out on behalf of one candidate or another. And I think it is very important that our intelligence officials, military officers, our diplomats, can say what Ryan Crocker says: I've served 6 presidents, 3 Republicans, and 3 Democrats, and I tried to serve all of them loyally. I think that is terribly important. And if you suddenly said, you know, when a new president comes in, suddenly you review the military, you know, you're very quickly, you know, gonna end up with political generals. And you're also going to have, quite frankly, people who are under the old administration carving up and positioning themselves to have a higher position in the new administration. I think it's been a very important principle that the promotions in the military are basically run by the military with the approval of the Secretary of Defense, based on experience and professionalism and competence. And boy, I think that's terribly important. And I would worry that the more you align this with the political election cycle, the more you politicize your military. Don't want to go there.
Loren, could I add to that? Because I could not agree more with Steve. I think that the statement by Mr. Trump that, you know, he might fire all the generals, or that the generals have been reduced to rubble, I mean, I think was incredibly destructive. I do think that we have had this going back at least to 1992, this tradition of both parties trotting out at each convention large numbers of flag officers to endorse the candidates and have dueling announcements. I abhor this. I think it is incredibly dangerous. I've seen what happens as a result, which is that, you know, there was a lot of hostility towards some of the uniformed military during the Clinton transition. In the Clinton to Bush transition, I heard a lot of discussion about Clinton generals. I heard some of that in 2009 about, you know, Bush generals. I think, you know, this is a very, very dangerous, bad trend. And, you know, particularly when you get retired general officers, as Pete Pace says, when you get up there, they're not interested in your name. It's general, whoever it is who's saying this. And when you get a retired general in front of a national political convention leading people in a chant of, you know, let's lock up our political opponents. I used to be ambassador to a country where they're locking up their political opponents, and I don't think it's a very good place to go.
Can I just mention one corollary? I think the same is true for the civil service. Yeah. You know, you have to, you know, treat them as the professionals they are. Don't treat them just because they served your predecessor well doesn't mean they can't be fully loyal and serve a new administration well. I think there's real risk in politicizing the civil service as well. Very important to send signals and include them in the leadership team in various ways to fully leverage that talent.
Because remember, the genius of our system is that a president is elected, comes in with political appointees, and they then have to deal with the professional civil service, military intelligence. And it's that intermediation of political direction from coming out of an election, working and meshing with the experience and expertise of the permanent government that actually leads to better outcomes for our country. You don't want to disrupt that.
Let's go to this side of the room. Mr. Hale.
Bob Hale, former DOD comptroller, now a fellow at Booz Allen. So the key, or one key to the transition, you've all said, that is to get people actually in place. That requires Senate confirmation. I think one of the successes of the 2008 and 9 transition in DOD was the batch approach to senior officials. Michèle, you and I benefited from that when the White House made appointments early, worked with the Senate Armed Services Committee, did the confirmation as a batch, as a group, and the result was many of the OSD leaders, at least, were in place by early February, less than a month after the inauguration. If you agree with me, are there ways we could encourage a new White House, whatever party occupies it, and perhaps work with the Senate Armed Services Committee to repeat that process? Or are there other thoughts you have on the confirmation process and how to speed it along?
No, I think that part of the transition job is to really prioritize what are your top 10, 15 positions in each department, and your strategy for trying to do that batching and getting those people through early. So really having a sense of prioritization for the sequence of confirmations. I think also the thing that has consistently been the choke point in every transition is actually the vetting process to get to the formal nomination. Transition teams always underestimate the number of vetting lawyers they're going to need up front. And that's the first choke point. The second is, of course, once the package goes to the Hill, of course, there's a whole new set of paperwork that's not identical to the paperwork you just had to fill out, so you have to go through it again. But I think you can, because we are still a nation with members of the military, our diplomatic service, intelligence service, who are actively, in dangerous places, in harm's way, conducting operations today. I think there's a basis for having a conversation up front with the leadership of the relevant committees and the leadership of the Senate to say, in the national security area, we really can't afford to mess around. We really do have to accelerate confirmations in these key areas to make sure that we protect the interests of the country. And last time around, there was great receptivity to that, and I think that's part of what got me and you in place by early February last time.
I just think the entire process is broken, and particularly the security clearance process is broken. Having just gone, through my 5-year security update, I had an OPM interviewer sit with me and go through my SF-86. And so it says here, your last supervisor in government was a Mr. Gates. I said, yes, that's correct. But I had a supervisor before that. Oh, well, why didn't you put that down on your form? Oh, well, that was a matter of record. That would have been Secretary Rumsfeld. Oh, how do you spell Rumsfeld? If I call this number, will Mr. Gates answer? I said, no, that'll be Dr. Carter. And who's Dr. Carter? So at which point I wanted to say, if you're trying to catch me, selling secrets to the enemy, it's like way too late, lady. I mean, and we really have to get a much more streamlined process.
Folks in the middle, you're in a complete glare to me, so you'll have to wave your hand if you have a question.
Thanks. Hi, Aaron Mehta with Defense News. We've heard a lot today from you guys about Bob Gates and the transition there and how it maybe went smoother than it could have. I'm wondering if there's lessons to be learned from that could be taken forward about whether or not a new administration should consider rolling over the Secretary of Defense who's there, at least for a 6-month period or even a year period, to get through the budget cycle to make sure current operations aren't impacted. Is that something that, and I'd love to hear from all three of you, is something that you would consider as potentially a good idea, or was the Gates transition something that was kind of unique given his personality and his experience?
Don't look at me.
I will step into the breach. I would say very quickly, I think either presidential candidate and any future president-elect ought to think about whether they want to extend a Secretary of Defense who's, particularly if you're in the middle of active military operations. And I think they also ought to consider whether you want to extend your DNI or maybe your CIA director, either your Director of National Intelligence or I think more appropriately, your Director of Central Intelligence. Again, in a time where you're having an awful lot of operations, there's, I think, a case to be made for some continuity for a period of time. And, you know, Bob Gates, I think, spent 2 years in the Bush administration, 2 years and a half maybe in the Obama administration. That's not a bad model.
Can I just add on the below the cabinet level, I think it's very important for a transition to identify, you know, there may be some people you want to keep on indefinitely, but also a number of people for the very reasons you described, that you want to make sure there's a face-to-face handoff of the baton so that people stay in place until their successor is confirmed and the handoff is direct. You don't want to gap key positions in the national security space.
You know, I recruited Mike Vickers to come to be the Assistant Secretary for SOLIC and in OSD when I was Undersecretary, in part because I hoped that Mike would survive a transition if we had one, and not, you know, he overfulfilled the plan, which is great. But I have to say, I have a little bit of skepticism about this. I had, you know, when Secretary Gates was, you know, about to go off and do this, I gave him some free, unsolicited advice, which he obviously ignored, which was that I didn't think it was a good idea for him to stay on. In part because I underestimated his ability to navigate the inevitable suspicions of an incoming administration about someone serving in a previous administration. I think that's an enormous tribute to Bob Gates and to his incredible skills. Not sure everybody has that, and I think it is not easy to navigate this kind of thing when you're at the cabinet level. And so I think it really depends very much on the individual personalities. I would be leery of a hard and fast rule here because I think it could go very badly wrong with the wrong personalities.
Steve, I want to go to something that I've heard you talk about before, about one president at a time, kind of building on this issue of this is a very delicate time, handing over in the November, December, January timeframe. Are there things that you need to be careful about handing over? You talked about how in the 08-09 transition, you know, there's a lot of collaboration between the Bush and Obama administration on the financial crisis. Also, prior to that, there was, you know, the Iraq SOFA negotiation was going on. That at some point in those months, the current administration will have to start making the call. You know, these are issues to either punt to the next administration or possibly even consult them on. Like, do you want us to make this decision now? Would you rather hold it until the next administration? Can you talk about your experience in managing that in 2008, 2009, and other lessons you want to offer to the next team?
Sure, I'll be very brief. Each of the campaigns designated somebody to be the liaison with, in my case, with me or with Secretary of State. And so we were doing the negotiations of the SOFA with Iraq. We had an ongoing war in Gaza going on. There was the financial crisis. And we would call up the designated persons and for the two campaigns and let them know what we were doing. We weren't soliciting their approval, but we were letting them know, keeping them informed, and if they had a preference, they could raise their hand and raise it with us. Secondly, I started about, once the election was over, I had a box on my desk where I would put matters that were up for either presidential decision or for me to decide that I thought the new administration might have an interest in, and I just stacked them up. And when the new team came in, we had one of our early sessions, and I made 2 copies of it, gave one to Tom Donnell and one to Jim Jones, the incoming National Security Advisor and Deputy National Security Advisor, and we went through them, you know, document by document. Here's the issue. Here's what the president wants to do. Here's what I would do in his name. Do you want us to take this action? Do you want us to hold it for you? Do you want us to take it so that you don't have to take it and get you off the hook? And I think that's the kind of thing you have to do with the new administration, and it worked very well, and I would commend that to the next transition.
So we've got time for one more question from the audience. Is there anyone out there who wants to weigh in, have the last word? Someone in the back, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Cindy Huang, a fellow at the Center for Global Development. I was wondering if you could comment on improving coordination between the three Ds, development, diplomacy, and defense during the transition, understanding that everyone already has a very full portfolio. Are there some best practices there?
I think all of you can weigh in.
You know, I do think that part of that norming and forming the team is bringing members of the, your prospective cabinet plus elements of the different agency transition teams together to start developing an integrated set of priorities and strategies and plans. And I think that it's very critical to do substantively. It's also a great way to get those folks working as a team together. I think the biggest challenge to that integration is actually the color of money on Capitol Hill. The fact that however integrated a plan you may develop, when you send it up to be funded on Capitol Hill, it's going to get broken into the piece parts, run through the respective committees, and more often than not, some portions like the DoD portion get more fully funded, and other portions like the state and development portions get less fully funded, and that tends to undermine the integration. So I think really thinking carefully, and there's some interesting proposals that were discussed in this recent budget cycle, like the Kane Amendment, where it allows some transfers, some pooling of resources across agencies, some greater flexibility on the funding mechanisms to actually support a more integrated approach. I think that's obviously something that will have to be looked at.
One early way to do that, I know Michèle has talked about the exercise done with some of the principals early on. It tends to focus on, okay, what do we do if there's an attack on the homeland? Because that's the most consequential thing people might have to face early on. But the reality is they're much more likely to face something like Zika or Ebola or something like that. And so maybe one way is to do an early exercise where you have to bring in the assistance and development folk, because they're the ones who have all the resident capability.
I think with that, we are out of time. I want to thank all three of you for participating in this. This has been an incredible panel. I also want to recommend someday moderating a panel with 3 former and current bosses, just to see if you can actually manage to survive the process. I came out unscathed, so far as I know. We have a 15-minute break coming up, and then we'll come back for our third session. Thank you all very much.